Well, hello everyone, and welcome to week 5 of our class. This week we're going to be talking about risk. All right, so let's take a look at what we talked about last week. Last week we talked about costs, project costs. We talked about estimating them, different ways that we can estimate the cost for tasks that we have to complete. We put together our budget and we talked about ways to control costs. Now we're going to take a look at risk. So project risk management is really important because if you don't get ahead of risks and control them, they could overtake your project and really set it back or actually have it be a complete failure. So as usual, PMI has a pretty straightforward framework for all of the knowledge areas, and risk management is no different. So this is the general framework, and we're going to talk about each one of these particular aspects. But overall, we need to, as usual, plan our risk management. Nothing just happens. So we need to plan how we're going to do it. Then we need to actually get to it. We'll look at identifying risks and then ranking them qualitatively, which means most important first, and then doing a quantitative risk analysis, which means trying to figure out, what is it going to cost us? What is the cost of that risk, and how much is it going to cost to mitigate it? That's the quantitative part. Then we're going to plan what we're going to do. There's several different risk response measures we can use. Then we're going to actually implement those, and then as the project progresses, we're going to monitor risk and see how any of that changes. Okay, so let's take a look at planning risk management. The big thing here is we need to, as usual, think about what we're going to do, and we're going to create our risk management plan. We're going to determine how we're going to assess risk, the different ways that we're going to catalog our risk, and so on. And we're going to build our risk management plan. There's lots of templates for it out there on the internet, and we're going to incorporate that. You can see the risk management plan gets incorporated into the project management plan. So much like we did the same thing with costs and resources. So we'll do the same thing with risk. We have to make our plan for how we're going to manage it. Once we have our plan, we need to take a look at how we actually structure it. Okay, so you remember in the past when we looked at scope, we had a work breakdown structure. Well, risk is no different. Once we identify our risks, we can actually put them into a risk breakdown structure from the highest level to lower levels, and I'll show you how this works later. So you see at level 0, it's the highest level for the project. Level 1 are your major tasks, and so on. So you can build a risk breakdown structure just like you can a work breakdown structure. So first thing we have to do is identify risks, and there's no magic to this. This actually is where you sit down, you look at each of the tasks that you're going to do from the highest level to the lowest level, and you have to, using expert knowledge and input from experts and other members of your team and so on, you need to determine what your risks are. So there's no magic to this, but it takes a lot of work, because you could just hand wave it and say, oh, well, there's just a couple of risks, here they are. Or you could really spend some time looking at all the possible risks, cataloging them, and then actually determining what you're going to do with those risks. The more time you spend thinking about things that could possibly go wrong, the better prepared you'll be when and if something actually does go wrong, so that you have a plan in place. You're not just reacting, you've already have a plan in place for what to do if a particular risk arises. So a lot of hard work done up front will save you time, money, and lots of other bad things later on in your project. So if you don't spend the right amount of time identifying your risks, you're really going to put you're really jeopardizing your project. So then we have to do qualitative risk analysis. There's two parts. So there's qualitative, and then the next slide we'll talk about quantitative. The big difference is qualitative is which of the risks are the most important, which are the ones that you really want to focus on, and you rank them from 1 to whatever. Okay, that's qualitative. You're assigning a quality factor to each one. Some are very high, some are middle, some are low. Okay, so you want to rank them from highest to lowest. That's qualitative risk analysis. Then you have to do quantitative risk analysis. So we ranked them from 1 till whatever. Now we need to actually assign some value to them, and it can be done in terms of cost. Generally, it's in cost, but there's other ways you can look at it as well. So that's, you're going to assign some value to it. So we've ranked them from highest to lowest, and then we're going to assign some value to them. So that's quantitative risk analysis. So let's take a look at measuring risk. Okay, so the main way to measure risk is called a PIM, the probability impact matrix. Okay, and you're going to see one below here. So risk is nothing more than a measure of the probability of something happening times the impact if it does happen. You could have something that has a very high probability but a very low impact, or something that has a very low probability and a very high impact. And you use those measures to get a risk score. And I'll talk about it here using the graphic at the bottom of the slide in a second. You're going to start off with an initial risk assessment, which is what you see below us here, which is when you first take all of your risks and you assign a probability and an impact, and you come up with a score. So let's take a look at this here. So this is from the exercise that we're doing in class, where we're providing an IT upgrade for Mama's Bakery. So I just picked some of my tasks based on the exercise that we're going to have coming up next week, where you have to complete this, where it says pick a level 1, level 2, level 3 task, and then an activity, and do a risk assessment on it. So that's exactly what you see here. So you can see from my work breakdown structure where I got them, the different level that it falls in, 1, 2, 3, or lower, what the actual task is, and then I actually went through and determined what a risk could be for that particular task. So you see here for provide infrastructure, which we're going to do for Mama's Bakery, a risk could be that the solution we come up with exceeds the budget. It's going to cost too much. Okay, the probability in my assessment is low, but the impact, if we do, is high. So probability times impact gives you a score. Now, this is a spreadsheet, and I'll make this available for all of you that are in the class with me. Essentially, all this stuff is already to go. You just populate it, and it comes up with a score. If it is below a certain level, it's green. If it's between a certain amount, it'll be amber. And if it's above a certain amount, it'll be red. I think if it's above 8, it's red. If it's between, I think, 5 and 7.99, it's amber. And if it's below 5, it's green. Now, that's totally arbitrary. This is based on your organization, but this is just what I'm using. Each organization will have its own way of cataloging and quantifying risk, as well as which risks are most important to that organization. So this is just a framework. You'd have to use a framework that makes sense for the organization that you're in. But this is an idea here of what it would look like. So you just, whatever the particular task is, the risk that you've determined for that task, and then the types of risk. Okay, you can have a risk to the project, or you can have a risk to the organization. A risk to the project is something that's going to affect the scope, the time, or it's going to cost you more money. Okay, a risk to the organization is you're going to do something as part of the project that's going to have external effects outside, and it may impact the organization in the form of they may get fines, they may get negative publicity, and so on. So you have to really think about every risk, and is it a risk to the project or is it a risk to the organization? So anyway, that's what you see here. And then again, kind of the risk impact area, scope, schedule, resource or cost, or technology. And that's really how we're going to go about doing our risk assessment. Okay. Then we need to plan risk responses. So what are we going to do about it? We've identified all these risks. Well, so what? Well, let's take a look at our different options as part of planning risk responses. We have really 4 main responses that we can use. We can avoid it altogether, meaning you just eliminate the threat, and I'll talk about that in a second. You can transfer it to another party, and everyone's familiar with this, which is insurance. Everyone has insurance on their car. That's nothing more than transferring the ownership of the risk to a third party. You can mitigate it, which is most likely what you're going to spend the most amount of time doing in your project. Steps to reduce the probability or the impact, or both. Or you could just accept it and say, well, you know, there's nothing I can do about it. You just acknowledge it, and then there's really nothing you can do. So avoiding the risk would be, for example, if you're going to build a factory and it's in a flood zone, you have a risk that your factory could be flooded. Well, you can avoid that altogether by determining that you don't want to build it there and building it somewhere else. So you've eliminated that threat. That's just an example of avoidance. So those are our different risk responses. And we're going to spend the most time on mitigation because that's the most common in a project. Okay, and then we're going to implement our risk responses. We're going to go and we're going to do mitigation, we're going to do transfer, whatever it is. If we need to buy insurance for particular things, we're going to go ahead and do those responses. And then you're going to see how our risk assessment changes when we actually apply risk responses. So this is the same thing before. I just left out the WBS levels and numbers over here. So here's where the same tasks, same risks, and this is our initial score. So you saw everything over here on the left side. Here I talk about what our mitigation is. What is our mitigation plan? So let's just take the first task that we looked at before. Now our risk was our solution is going to cost too much. And then our mitigation plan is to review all the contracts thoroughly and make sure we're getting the best cost, make sure that the technology we're going to put in place is the most appropriate, and so on. So we're going to spend time reviewing our contracts. And you can see in this case, it reduced our probability from 10% to 5%. The impact's still there. If it goes over, it's still a high impact, but it reduced the probability, and our score went down from 1 to 0.5. Okay, so it was acceptable to start with, and it's even lower now. And so on. You can just kind of see how that's going to work. Here's the second one. So our risk here, solution lacks flexibility and expandability for what we were going to do for Mama's Bakery. Okay, and initially it came up with a 2.64 because it had a 33% probability, and the impact was fairly high at 8 out of 10. But we're going to work with all of our consultants and subject matter experts and make sure that we have flexibility and expandability built into our solutions. We're going to look at that up front and make sure we're not surprised by anything. It has reduced our probability from 33% to 25%, and our impact from 8 to 5. So overall score reduced from 2.64 to 1.25. That's exactly how risk mitigation works. And at the end, you have your mitigated risk assessment, which is on the right. And you'll use this as part of your project plan and in the documents that you produce to show that you've thought through everything. And in the end, you can see how some of these started very high, like this one here is an 8.1, so it's a very high risk. And we've mitigated it down to 4.8, which is still a moderate risk. So that's something you likely would need to take up with a sponsor and make sure that they're aware of it. All of the low risks, depending on your organization, generally are fine, but the moderate and the high risks, you're going to need to work with your sponsor and make sure that they fully understand the risks, the mitigation plan that's going to be put in place, and then the residual risk, which is what's left after you've mitigated it. And then in the end, as your project progresses, you're going to monitor risk. Did any of the risk events that you thought were possible, did they happen? And if they happen, you need to take actions on them. And that's what happens during the monitoring phase. You may make some changes, you may implement your risk mitigation actions, whatever. But you're going to constantly monitor risk throughout the project. Okay, that is our discussion on risk. So our assignment for week 5. Okay, so our assignment for week 5 is built on what we learned in week 4. So we're going to do an assignment that focuses on project resources and costs. So please read the ITP master document, pages 42 to 49, to talk about assigning resources and costs to your project schedule. And then in our classroom, I will have a link for a screen recording that I'm going to do that shows you in Microsoft Project exactly how to do the tasks that we're going to talk about. Okay, that's week 5's assignment. And then, of course, if you have questions, please email me or post on the Ask Your Professor section. And don't wait to the last minute. All right, that's it for this week. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next week.